A father and his 2-year-old son vanish from their campsite, leaving a scene of eerie normalcy. 6 years later, their truck is pulled from a lake, revealing a secret far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The crisp autumn air of the Serenity Valley bit at Sheriff Brody's cheeks, painting them a raw, wind-chapped red as he stared at the abandoned campsite. 3 days. 3 agonizing days since Liam, a young father with a laugh as easy as the creek's flow, and his 2-year-old son, Finn, a boy with eyes as bright as mountain wildflowers, were last seen. The scene before him was a tableau of eerie normalcy. The tent still zipped shut, its nylon skin taut against the gentle breeze, 2 sleeping bags neatly rolled inside as if awaiting their occupants' return. A half-eaten bag of trail mix, now a stale, forgotten offering, sat on a rough-hewn log beside a cold fire pit. It was as if they had simply stepped away for a moment, perhaps to gather more firewood or splash in the nearby stream, and then, inexplicably, never returned. Brody's gloved hand, calloused from years of gripping steering wheels and rifle stocks, traced the rough, sooty rim of the fire pit. His brow, usually a calm expanse, was now a landscape of furrowed lines, a testament to the perplexing blend of confusion and a growing, icy dread that snaked through his gut. He had known Liam since the boy was knee-high, a responsible and wood-savvy young man who could navigate these very trails blindfolded. The idea of Liam intentionally putting his son in harm's way was not just unthinkable. It was a betrayal of every instinct Brody knew the man possessed. That was the official line he fed to the local press, a calming platitude designed to soothe the worried townsfolk of Silver Creek, to keep the fragile hope flickering in their eyes. He'd stood before the cameras, his voice a steady drone, assuring them that every resource was being deployed, every effort being made. But deep down, a colder, more sinister thought took root, an insidious whisper that gnawed at the edges of his practiced composure. He remembered the strained look in Liam's eyes just last week at the general store, a haunted expression that seemed utterly out of place on the usually cheerful father. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a deep, unsettling shadow, a burden Brody couldn't quite decipher then, but that now loomed large in his memory. Brody's objective was clear, painted in stark, uncompromising strokes. Find Liam and Finn, and bring them home safe. The emotional stakes were immense, a crushing weight that pressed down on him with the force of the entire town's collective hope and burgeoning fear. Silver Creek, a community woven together by generations of shared hardship and quiet joys, was holding its breath, a silent testament to the bond that tied them all. Brody felt the crushing weight of their unspoken pleas on his shoulders, a burden far heavier than any physical load. He surveyed the dense, unforgiving wilderness that stretched out in every direction, a silent, emerald ocean of towering pines and unforgiving granite peaks. The forest, usually a source of comfort and solitude, now felt like a vast, hungry maw, ready to swallow secrets whole. He had a hidden motivation, a personal one that gnawed at him with the persistence of a dull ache. 20 years ago, in these very woods, his own younger brother, barely more than a boy, had gotten lost and was never found. The memory, a raw, unhealed wound, resurfaced with chilling clarity. This case felt like a ghost from his past, a chance at a redemption he never knew he needed, a silent promise to a memory he couldn't quite grasp. The tension in the air was as thick as the morning fog that still clung to the valley floor, a palpable entity that whispered of unseen dangers, of cold nights and a silence that stretched on forever. He turned to his deputy, a younger man named Caleb, whose face was a mask of grim determination, his youth unable to fully mask the apprehension in his eyes. Search the riverbank again, every inch. Something's not right here. I can feel it in my bones. It's like the woods themselves swallowed them whole. The screech of tires on gravel announced Elias's arrival, a jarring intrusion into the hushed anxiety of Silver Creek. His gleaming city car, a stark, polished obsidian against the dusty, sun-baked pickups lining Main Street, crunched to a halt directly in front of the sheriff's office. He unfolded himself from the low-slung vehicle, a man cut from a different cloth than the townsfolk, his tailored suit a statement of a life spent in climate-controlled boardrooms, not under the raw, unfiltered sky. Every crease in his trousers was sharp, every inch of his polished shoes gleaming, a testament to a world far removed from the rugged wilderness that now held his family captive. He strode into the humble office, the air of the city clinging to him like an invisible cloak. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of 3 days' futile searching, looked up from a scattered array of maps. Their eyes met, and the tension was immediate, a palpable current that sparked between them. Elias's gaze, the same piercing blue as Liam's, held a different kind of fire, a raw, untamed grief that seemed to war with a tightly coiled anger. That anger, Brody observed, seemed less directed at the unknown that had swallowed Liam and Finn, and more at the very mountains that loomed over them, silent and indifferent. For Elias, the emotional stakes were monumental, a chasm threatening to open beneath the carefully constructed edifice of his life. The potential loss of his only brother and his nephew was a devastation he hadn't prepared for, a blow that reverberated through the carefully ordered corridors of his existence. Yet his motivations were far from simple. He and Liam, brothers by blood, had been estranged for years, a bitter falling out over their family's inheritance, leaving a wound that had festered unaddressed. Elias saw this tragedy not just as a loss, but as a final, cruel twist of fate in their fractured relationship, a definitive, brutal end to any hope of reconciliation. Brody, in turn, saw a man whose wealth and arrogance could hinder, rather than help, the delicate, nuanced search operation. He'd dealt with city folk before, those who believed money and influence could bend the immutable laws of the wilderness. Elias, for his part, saw a small-town cop, out of his depth, a man ill-equipped to handle a situation of this magnitude. This unspoken assessment hung heavy in the air between them, thick as the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the office window. Elias's strategic mind, honed in the cutthroat world of corporate finance, was already at work, sharp and relentless. He began to dissect Brody's efforts, questioning every procedure, every assumption the sheriff and his team had made. "What's the perimeter of your search, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice clipped, betraying no emotion save for an underlying impatience. "What resources have you deployed? Are you relying solely on local volunteers? Have you considered bringing in specialized tracking units from outside the county?" Each question was a jab, a subtle accusation of inadequacy that grated on Brody's already frayed nerves. Brody stiffened, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Thorne. This isn't a boardroom and these aren't spreadsheets. These are dangerous woods. And my brother and nephew are in them," Elias countered, his voice rising a fraction. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. It was a picture of Liam and Finn, their faces bright with laughter, their smiles a stark, painful contrast to the grim reality of the situation. He held it out, not quite offering it, but presenting it as evidence of the life now hanging by a thread. His gaze returned to Brody, a flicker of something raw and desperate momentarily eclipsing the anger. "My brother is a survivor, Sheriff. He's resourceful, but he's also impulsive. He had a secret, something he was running from, and I have a feeling it led him right into the heart of this." The hand-carved wooden bird, tiny and exquisitely detailed, lay nestled in the verdant moss, a splash of unnatural warmth against the cool, damp forest floor. Sheriff Brody's gloved fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was unmistakably Finn's. Liam had whittled dozens of these for his son, each one a testament to his patient, loving nature. The intricate curves of its wings, the smooth, worn texture of the wood. It was a tangible link, a lifeline thrown from the abyss of their despair. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, coursed through Brody. This wasn't just a clue. It was a beacon, a whisper of hope that had been all but extinguished. "Silas, you magnificent old dog," Brody breathed, turning to the seasoned tracker, his voice thick with emotion. Silas, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, offered a rare, slight nod, his keen eyes already scanning the surrounding terrain. Found it near here, Sheriff. Looks like it was dropped, not placed. The implications were immediate and stark. If it was dropped, Liam and Finn were moving, perhaps even in a hurry. Their objective, once a broad, desperate search, now narrowed with terrifying precision. Follow this new trail, push deeper into the treacherous backcountry. Every fiber of Brody's being screamed for action, for movement. The long, agonizing days of fruitless searching, the hollow echoes of their calls swallowed by the indifferent wilderness, had worn him thin. Now a spark, a desperate, fragile spark. But with this glimmer of hope came a chilling shadow of doubt. The bird was found near the yawning maw of the old, abandoned North Star mine. The mine, a place steeped in local legend, whispered about in hushed tones around campfires. A place claimed to be cursed, a labyrinth of collapsing tunnels and forgotten shafts. A place no sane person would venture into willingly. Brody felt a cold dread trickle down his spine, a premonition that tightened his gut. The emotional stakes skyrocketed. The possibility that Liam, responsible and wood-savvy as he was, had taken his 2-year-old son into that dangerous, fabled darkness was almost too terrible to contemplate. It defied logic, defied common sense. A sudden, sharp movement caught Brody's eye. Elias, Liam's older brother, stood at the edge of the search perimeter, his city clothes smudged with dirt, his face a mask of agitation. Brody had sent word, and Elias, ever the storm front, had arrived quickly. Upon hearing the news of the bird and its proximity to the mine, Elias's usual controlled demeanor had fractured. His hidden motivations, a bitter blend of long-standing family resentment and a desperate, unspoken love for his brother, bubbled closer to the surface. He spoke, his voice strained and tight, of Liam's peculiar fascination with their family's history, of their great-grandfather who had perished in that very mine a century ago. He wouldn't be so foolish, Brody insisted, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and fear, trying to inject reason into the rising panic. He knew Liam. He knew him to be cautious, especially with Finn. This didn't fit. Elias's laugh was brittle, humorless, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to tear at the fragile hope hanging in the air. You didn't know him like I did, Sheriff. My brother was always chasing ghosts, always trying to prove something. He believed there was something more than just rock and dust in that mine, something that could solve all his problems. The North Star mine entrance loomed, a gaping, jagged wound in the mountainside that seemed to exhale a palpable, ancient cold. A suffocating unease settled over the small group standing before it. Sheriff Brody, his young deputy Caleb, the grizzled tracker Silas, and a reluctant Elias, his city clothes already smudged with the grim dust of the wilderness. The objective was terrifyingly clear. They had to go in. Every instinct in Brody's body screamed against it. The chilling tales of collapses, methane pockets, and poisonous gases from his childhood echoing like a macabre lullaby in his mind. He remembered the desperate whispers of old-timers, their faces etched with the grim resolve of men who had seen the mine swallow lives whole. Yet, the discovery of Finn's small, wooden bird, identical to the one Liam was always whittling for his son, nestled in the moss so close to the foreboding maw left them no other choice. It was a tangible thread, fragile yet insistent, pulling them into the abyss. The emotional stakes, already raw and frayed, had reached a fever pitch. The delicate line between hope and utter despair was now as thin and sharp as a freshly cleaved shard of granite, threatening to snap with the slightest tremor. Brody felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air and everything to do with the dread churning in his gut. He thought of Liam, the responsible, wood-savvy young man he'd known since childhood, and the haunted look in his eyes just last week. What could have driven him to this place? A place no sane person would willingly enter. His gloved hands tightened around the flashlight, the cool metal a small anchor in the rising tide of his fear. He stole a glance at Elias, who stood slightly apart from the others. For all his earlier bravado and corporate polish, the city man seemed visibly unnerved by the oppressive darkness, his face pale and stark in the weak, diffused light of their headlamps. The arrogance that had bristled between him and Brody earlier had been replaced by a raw, naked fear. Elias's hidden motivation, that desperate, gnawing need to understand his brother's final, reckless act, warred fiercely with his own primal instinct for self-preservation. Brody could see the internal struggle in the clenching of Elias's jaw, the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his own headlamp. As they meticulously prepared their equipment, checking headlamp batteries, securing rope, and readying first aid kits, the tension between Brody and Elias, though unspoken, crackled in the strained silence. It was a silent testament to their differing worlds, now forced into a reluctant, dangerous proximity. Elias cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet air. "Are you sure this is the only way, Sheriff? This place, it looks like a tomb." His voice, usually precise and confident, held an uncharacteristic tremor. Brody met his gaze, his own resolve hardening. "The boy's toy was here, Elias. We follow every lead, no matter how grim it looks." He kept his voice even, projecting a calm he didn't entirely feel. He couldn't afford panic, not now, not when the lives of a father and son hung in the balance. It was Caleb, the young deputy, who found the next clue, one that would change everything. He had been meticulously examining the weathered, graffiti-scarred wooden frame of the mine entrance, his headlamp beam sweeping slowly over the ancient timbers. "Sheriff!" His voice, usually steady, was tight with alarm, a sharp intake of breath following his exclamation. Brody immediately turned, his flashlight beam snapping to where Caleb was pointing. Scratched into the rough-hewn wood, barely legible amidst years of carved initials and forgotten dates, was a message. It was hastily carved, the letters shallow and uneven, as if etched in a desperate hurry. Brody knelt, shining his light directly onto the inscription. The words sprang out of the gloom, stark and chilling. "Forgive me, I had to protect him." The words hung in the cold, still air, a cryptic and profoundly unsettling confession. A cold dread seeped into Brody's heart, heavier than any fear of the mine itself. What did Liam need to be forgiven for? The question echoed in the cavernous silence, a phantom voice whispering doubt. And who or what did he need to protect his son from? The implication was immediate, chilling, and far more sinister than anything Brody had considered. This wasn't just a lost father and son. This was something else entirely. The dramatic irony was a bitter, crushing weight. They had come seeking the lost, their hearts heavy with simple, agonizing worry. Instead, they had stumbled upon a message that suggested a far more complex and dangerous narrative, one filled with hidden motives and desperate acts. Brody's mind raced, the scattered pieces of the puzzle he'd been trying to assemble rearranging themselves into a picture he didn't want to see. The strained look in Liam's eyes at the general store, the feeling that something was not right at the abandoned campsite, Liam's innate wood savvy contrasting with the seemingly haphazard disappearance. It all coalesced into a terrifying, coherent theory. He pushed down the rising panic, forcing himself to think clearly, methodically. He felt Caleb's hand on his shoulder, the young man's face pale in the reflected light of Brody's lamp. "Protect him from what?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling slightly, echoing Brody's own unspoken question. Brody stood, turning to face the oppressive, inky darkness of the mine. He shone his flashlight into the black maw, the powerful beam swallowed instantly by the impenetrable gloom, as if the mine itself was absorbing the light, refusing to give up its secrets. "I'm starting to think we've been asking the wrong questions all along." The air inside the North Star mine was a heavy, stagnant blanket, pressing in from all sides. It tasted of damp earth, of ancient rock, and something else. A faint, metallic tang that hinted at forgotten industry and deeper, unsettling secrets. Sheriff Brody's headlamp beam, a sharp, dancing cone of light, sliced through the oppressive blackness, revealing glistening rock walls that wept with subterranean moisture and the skeletal remains of timber supports, gnawed by time and decay. Each breath felt thick, a struggle against the suffocating weight of the mountain above them. Their objective was simple, yet daunting. Follow the main tunnel, a desperate search for any sign of Liam or Finn. A footprint, a scrap of clothing, anything that could whisper of their passage. But the mine was a disorienting labyrinth, a monstrous, echoing maw that swallowed light and sound. Branching passages veered off into unseen depths, gaping shafts plunged into the abyss, and every turn felt like a step deeper into the earth's unforgiving embrace. Brody felt the insidious tendrils of claustrophobia beginning to coil around his chest, a primal fear of being buried alive. He fought it, clenching his jaw, refusing to let the terror show on his face, especially not to Caleb, his young deputy, whose own eyes darted nervously into the shadows. The emotional stakes were etched on every face in their small party. The fragile hope that had propelled them into this dark realm was now battling a rising tide of dread, a cold certainty that this place was not meant for the living. For Brody, the darkness of the mine was a cruel, painful reminder of his own past failure, of the younger brother he had lost to these very mountains 2 decades ago, a ghost that still haunted his waking hours. He was driven by a grim, relentless focus, a desperate, unspoken vow that history would not repeat itself on his watch. He would not lose another boy to the wilderness, not if he could help it. Elias, surprisingly, seemed to find a strange, unsettling resolve in the suffocating darkness. The initial fear that had clouded his features at the mine's entrance had been replaced by a cold, almost analytical determination. His tailored suit, now smudged with mine dust, seemed less out of place, a testament to his adaptability. His hidden motivation, once a simmering resentment over a family inheritance, had transformed into an all-consuming fire. It was no longer just about finding his brother. It was about uncovering the truth of the secret Liam carried, a truth Elias now believed was intrinsically linked to this mine and their family's cursed legacy, a whisper of a past that refused to stay buried. He moved with a newfound purpose, his headlamp beam sweeping methodically across the rock face, searching for answers in the ancient stone. Silas, the seasoned tracker and Brody's old friend, moved with a quiet confidence that belied the oppressive environment. His senses, honed by decades in the wilderness, seemed to be even more attuned to the subtle language of the underground world. He paused frequently, his gaze sweeping the uneven floor, his ears straining against the profound silence that seemed to absorb every sound. It was he who noticed them first. Faint scuff marks, barely discernible in the dust and grit on the floor of a narrow side tunnel, marks that deviated sharply from the main path they had been following. He knelt, his calloused fingers tracing the faint indentations. "Someone came through here, and not too long ago," Silas stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the silence, yet carried an undeniable weight. "They were in a hurry." "Sheriff, listen," Caleb whispered, his voice a tight thread of alarm that sliced through the heavy silence of the mine. Brody froze, every muscle tensing, his head cocked to catch whatever had snagged his deputy's attention. At first, there was only the familiar, unsettling symphony of the underground. The shallow rasp of their own breathing, the faint, irregular drip of water echoing from some unseen crevice, the distant creak of ancient timbers shifting under the immense weight of the mountain. Then, subtle but distinct, it reached him. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, persistent and unnerving, drifting from the inky blackness ahead. It was like a tiny, metallic heartbeat pulsing in the heart of the earth. A jolt of adrenaline surged through Brody, sharp and cold, chasing away the creeping claustrophobia that had begun to coil in his gut. Was it Liam? Could it be a signal, a desperate plea for help from the lost father? The objective crystallized in his mind, sharp and immediate. Locate the source of that sound. Hope, a fragile, persistent ember, flared in his chest, warring fiercely with the gnawing fear that had become his constant companion since Liam and Finn vanished. He pushed forward, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each beat echoing the escalating tension in the cavernous gloom. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, as they navigated a sharp, unforgiving bend in the tunnel. The air, already stale, now seemed to press in on them, thick with anticipation. Elias, his face a grim mask of apprehension, tightened his grip on the heavy flashlight, its beam dancing nervously ahead. Silas, ever the stoic tracker, moved with a quiet, practiced stealth, his eyes scanning the rough-hewn walls as if reading a hidden language in the rock. The sound led them deeper, pulling them into a smaller, more intimate passage that promised to yield its secret. They emerged into a small, irregularly shaped cavernous chamber, barely large enough for the four of them to stand comfortably. The sight that greeted them in the center of that oppressive space stole the air from their lungs, leaving them breathless and stunned. There, bathed in the intersecting beams of their headlamps, sat a small, battery-powered metronome, the kind used for music practice. Its polished, triangular arm swung back and forth with a steady, relentless click, click, click. It was a mechanical heartbeat, devoid of warmth or life, yet undeniably present. The realization hit Brody with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a desperate signal. This was a deliberate deception, a cruel and calculated diversion. A wave of cold, righteous fury washed over him, a bitterness so profound it tasted like rust in his mouth. This was not the act of a man who was simply lost, disoriented and helpless. This was the act of someone who did not want to be found, someone who was actively misleading them, playing a twisted game with their hopes and fears. The dramatic irony was a bitter pill, difficult to swallow. They had followed a sound of hope, a potential lifeline, only to be led deeper into a layer of intricate deceit. Elias stared at the metronome, his face a mask of profound disbelief and dawning horror. His jaw was slack, and his eyes, usually sharp and analytical, were wide with a raw, uncomprehending anguish. He moved slowly, as if in a trance, his hand reaching out tentatively, then pulling back. "Liam hated music," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a strained, almost broken sound that seemed swallowed by the silence of the chamber. He never would have owned something like this. The relentless click-clack of the metronome echoed in the small, frigid chamber, a mocking rhythm that chipped away at the already frayed nerves of the search party. Elias's face, pale and streaked with mind dust, contorted into a mask of pure fury. "This is a game to him," he roared, his voice cracking as it ricocheted off the damp rock walls. "He's leading us on a wild goose chase while my nephew is in danger." He gestured wildly at the innocuous little device, his hand trembling. The accusation, raw and venomous, struck Brody like a physical blow, despite his own churning stomach. He'd prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, to keep a level head when others lost theirs. But Liam, the man he'd known since he was a boy, was increasingly appearing not as a desperate victim, but as a cunning manipulator. The evidence was undeniable. The abandoned campsite, the perfectly arranged sleeping bags, the half-eaten trail mix, and now, this cruel diversion. Brody felt the heat rise in his own chest, a mix of frustration and a dawning, terrifying understanding. He gripped the cold metal of his flashlight, its beam dancing erratically as his hand tightened. His objective, once a clear path to rescuing a lost father and son, was now obscured by a thick fog of deception. He had to maintain control, had to prevent this suffocating mine, and the bizarre clues within it, from tearing his small team apart. Panic, he knew, was a far deadlier enemy than any rockfall. Elias's emotional stakes were laid bare, stark and agonizing. The fear for Finn, once a vague, gnawing dread, was now laced with a bitter sense of betrayal. He had come here, a city man venturing into a wilderness he despised, out of a desperate need to find his brother, to mend a fractured past. Now, that need was twisted by the horrifying realization that Liam might have orchestrated this entire nightmare. His hidden motivation to understand his brother's mysterious life, the secrets he kept, burned with a furious intensity. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "We don't know the whole story," Brody countered, his voice strained but firm, trying to inject a semblance of reason into the charged air. "There's a reason for this, and we need to find it. We can't jump to conclusions." He looked from Elias to Caleb, then to Silas, seeing the uncertainty etched on their faces. The solidarity they had shared at the mine's entrance had fractured, replaced by suspicion and bewilderment. But Elias was beyond reason, his eyes wild with a desperate, all-consuming need for truth. He pointed a trembling finger at Brody, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that seemed to echo Liam's own desperation. "You're just like him, a small-town man with small-town ideas. You can't see what's right in front of you." He took a ragged breath, the words tumbling out in a torrent. "My brother was involved in something dangerous, something he was trying to escape." He mentioned an old partner, a man named Marcus who he said owed him. The name hung in the cold, still air of the mine chamber, a new and unexpected piece of the puzzle. It was a jolt, a sudden shift in the narrative's gravity. Liam wasn't just running from some vague, undefined secret. He was running from a specific person. The image of the cheerful, wood-savvy father shattered completely, replaced by a darker, more complex figure embroiled in a dangerous game. Brody's mind raced, grappling with this new information. Marcus, partner, a debt. The strategic decision-making now lay squarely on his shoulders, a heavy weight that pressed down on him. Do they continue deeper into this disorienting labyrinth, following Liam's misleading trail, or do they pull back, surface from this oppressive darkness, and investigate this new lead? His gut clenched. The metronome clicked on, a constant reminder of the calculated deceit. Before Brody could articulate his thoughts, before he could weigh the options aloud, Silas, the seasoned tracker, straightened from where he had been examining the chamber floor. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed as he held his lamp low, illuminating the faint, almost imperceptible disturbances in the fine layer of dust. "He wasn't alone," Silas rumbled, his voice cutting through the tension like a dull blade. "There are two sets of footprints here. One is Liam's. The other belongs to a much larger man." The chill that settled over Serenity Valley wasn't just from the encroaching autumn. It was the icy grip of a case gone cold. The revelation of a second man's footprints in the North Star mine, larger and deeper than Liam's, had twisted the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more sinister, a potential abduction. Coupled with Elias's desperate mention of a Marcus, who Liam had supposedly owed, a new, unsettling narrative had begun to form, only to dissolve into frustrating dead ends. Brody's team, along with every willing local and volunteer, had scoured the treacherous depths of the mine for weeks, then months. They mapped every tunnel, checked every crevice, but the trail had simply vanished. The second set of footprints, so clear in the initial moments of discovery, had faded into the indistinguishable dust of a collapsed section, leaving behind only the crushing weight of unanswered questions. The initial surge of hope that had galvanized Silver Creek slowly, agonizingly, receded. It was replaced by a quiet, pervasive grief, a heavy blanket that smothered the town's once vibrant spirit. The daily news reports dwindled, replaced by the hushed whispers of a local tragedy. Liam and Finn, once tangible figures in the community, became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to wide-eyed children about the dangers lurking in the vast, unforgiving Rockies. The official search, after countless hours and dwindling leads, was eventually called off. The decision, though inevitable, felt like a public declaration of defeat, a surrender to the wilderness that had so effortlessly claimed its victims for Sheriff Brody. However, the clock hadn't stopped that autumn day 6 years ago. The passing seasons, the blizzards that buried the valley in pristine white and the springs that melted into rushing rivers, felt like an insult, a relentless march of time against his personal stasis. The unsolved case became his quiet, unyielding obsession, a phantom limb that constantly ached. Every morning, the lines on his face seemed a little deeper, etched not just by age, but by the relentless weight of his failure. The image of his own younger brother, lost to these same mountains 2 decades prior and never found, superimposed itself onto Liam and Finn's vanishing act. This wasn't just a case file. It was a chance at a redemption he desperately craved, a chance to rewrite a personal history marred by helplessness. He never truly stopped searching, even when everyone else did. Late nights found him hunched over the dusty case files, the scent of old paper and stale coffee filling his office. He revisited the North Star mine countless times, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Each visit a futile hope that a new angle, a forgotten detail, would suddenly emerge from the shadows. He chased down every rumor, however faint, however improbable, like a man possessed, driven by a hidden motivation that gnawed at his very core. The raw, immediate emotional stakes of the initial search had transformed into a dull, chronic ache, a constant hum of unresolved trauma that vibrated beneath the surface of his every interaction. The high tension of those early days had given way to the heavy, suffocating silence of time, a silence punctuated only by the echo of his own unanswered questions. Elias, Liam's older brother, couldn't bear the constant, painful reminders. He had moved away from Silver Creek shortly after the official search concluded, the looming mountains and the suffocating memories they held proving too much to bear. His calls to Brody, sporadic and strained, were formal and brief, yet an unspoken understanding lingered between them. They were two men bound by a shared, unresolved trauma, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that had swallowed their loved ones. The sharp, corporate edge Elias once possessed had softened, replaced by a weariness that even his meticulously tailored suits couldn't hide when he occasionally returned for legal formalities. The world, indeed, moved on. Children who were toddlers when Liam and Finn disappeared were now in elementary school. New businesses opened, old ones closed. Life, in its relentless way, persisted. But for Brody, a part of him remained frozen in that autumn 6 years ago, forever tethered to the moment the earth seemed to swallow a father and his son whole. Then, as the summer recreation season began to fully bloom 6 years after the disappearance, a ripple disturbed the tranquil surface of Serenity Lake, a popular spot for fishing and kayaking. It was a routine patrol for Brody, the kind of day meant for quiet contemplation and enjoying the deceptive calm of the valley. A group of teenagers, their voices still carrying the careless lightness of youth, approached his patrol car near the lake's edge, their faces a mixture of excitement and bewildered awe. They had been experimenting with a new, high-tech underwater drone, its small propellers humming softly as it explored the deeper, unseen parts of the lake. Their discovery, relayed in breathless, overlapping sentences, sliced through Brody's quiet resignation like a knife. "Sheriff," one of them blurted, his eyes wide, "we found something. Something metallic, wedged between the rocks at the bottom, in the deepest part." Brody felt a prickle of unease, a familiar premonition that something significant was about to disrupt the practiced rhythm of his days. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden tremor in his gut. The teenager pointed towards the shimmering expanse of the lake, his arm trembling slightly. "A truck, Sheriff. An old, rusted pickup truck. The same model Liam had been driving. The past, it seemed, was not as buried as everyone believed. And they said they saw something else down there. Sheriff, something inside." The shrill ring of the phone, usually a dull throb in the background of his quiet office, ripped through the afternoon silence like a siren. Sheriff Brody snatched the receiver, his "Brody here" a clipped command. On the other end, the voice of the teenage caller, breathless and tumbling over itself, spoke of a drone, a shimmering anomaly, and then the word that sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Truck. Not just any truck, but that truck. Liam's truck. Submerged for 6 years in the murky depths of Serenity Lake, a body of water he drove past almost every day. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, metallic and sharp. For years, he'd scoured every inch of the mountains, crawled through forgotten caves, and felt the whisper of false leads on every gust of wind, convinced the earth held the answers. All along, the truth, or at least a crucial piece of it, had been lying dormant beneath the familiar ripples of the lake. His first call, before even dispatching a unit, was to Elias. The connection crackled, a fragile bridge spanning 6 years of unspoken grief, simmering resentment, and a shared, gaping wound. "They found it, Elias," Brody managed, his voice rough, a sharp intake of breath on the other end, then a strangled sound that was half gasp, half sob. Elias, Liam's older brother, was a man carved from city steel, usually composed, even aloof. Now his carefully constructed facade crumbled across the miles. Where? The single word, raw with rekindled hope and terror, clawed its way through the phone line. Brody explained, his words precise, outlining the location, the initial reports. Elias was on the first flight to Silver Creek, the journey a blur of agonizing minutes, each one stretching into an eternity. The air in Silver Creek, usually crisp and pine-scented, now thrummed with a nervous energy, thick with whispers and speculative glances. The news of the truck had spread like wildfire, igniting dormant fears and desperate prayers. Brody moved with a meticulous, almost feverish energy, directing the nascent recovery operation. He felt the weight of their collective hope and dread pressing down on him, a heavy cloak woven from the unspoken questions in every townsman's eyes. The logistical hurdles were immediate and daunting. Serenity Lake was deceptively deep, its underwater terrain a labyrinth of jagged rocks and hidden currents. The truck, the teenagers reported, was not simply resting on the bottom. It was wedged, as if deliberately, into a treacherous rock formation. He knew this wasn't a job for local diverse or standard tow trucks. This called for something more. He made the calls, reaching out to a specialized deepwater recovery team from a city hours away. The arrival of their heavy-duty cranes, their barges like colossal metallic beasts, and their sophisticated underwater sonar equipment was a stark, almost alien intrusion on the tranquil landscape of the valley. The lakeside, usually a place of quiet recreation, was now a buzzing hive of activity. Generators hummed, winches groaned, and the sharp scent of diesel fuel mingled with the fresh mountain air. Brody stood on the rocky shore, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the divers in their bulky suits prepare for the plunge. He felt a profound sense of dramatic irony gnawing at him. For 6 long years, he had been haunted by the ghost of his own past failure, the image of his younger brother, lost to these very woods, a constant, nagging ache. This case had become inextricably linked to that personal grief, a chance at a redemption he never knew he needed. Now, standing on the edge of this lake, he realized he had been looking in the wrong direction, walking past the answer every single day. He owed it to the ghosts of this valley, to his own brother, and to the boy he'd never even met, to know what was in that truck. The lead diver, a burly man with kind but intensely focused eyes, surfaced after his initial reconnaissance. He pulled back his mask, water streaming from his face. His expression was grim. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The cab is empty, but the truck bed, it's been welded shut with a heavy steel plate. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure whatever is in there stayed hidden." The air thrummed with the strained whine of heavy machinery as the rusted pickup truck, encrusted with 6 years of lakebed grime, finally breached the surface of Serenity Lake. It emerged, dripping and grotesque, like some ancient, skeletal beast hauled from a watery grave, its once vibrant paint now a faded, mottled rust, draped in slimy tendrils of green-black weeds. A plume of silty, putrid water cascaded from its frame, mingling with the spray of the lake. On the shore, a silent crowd of townsfolk, their faces etched with a morbid curiosity and a somber reverence, watched the grim spectacle unfold. Each person held their breath, their collective fear a palpable shroud in the crisp autumn air. Sheriff Brody stood at the water's edge, his jaw clenched, the cold mist clinging to his stubbled cheeks. Beside him, Elias, Liam's older brother, had shed his pristine city attire for practical, earth-toned outdoor gear. The arrogance that usually clung to him like a second skin was gone, replaced by a raw, exposed nerve of anticipation and dread. His eyes, fixed on the emerging truck, were wide with an almost unbearable tension. The long, agonizing wait was nearing its end, and the potential answers it held felt both like a salvation and a curse. Brody could feel the weight of Elias's gaze, a silent question hanging between them. Is this it? Is this the end of our search? The central conflict, for so long a wrestling match with the unforgiving wilderness and the ghostly echoes of the North Star mine, had solidified into something tangible, something brutally real. a solid plate of welded steel obscuring the truck's bed. This barrier, forged by desperate hands years ago, now stood as the final, agonizing hurdle between them and the truth. Their collective objective was singular, stark, and terrifyingly clear. Open it. Finally, see what Liam, or perhaps the ominous Marcus, had sealed away 6 years ago. The emotional stakes were almost unbearable. Every screech of the cutting torch that would soon rend metal felt like a scream tearing through Brody's own soul. He had lived with this case, this gnawing failure, for so long that its resolution, whatever it might be, felt inextricably linked to his own identity. Brody's team moved with a focused intensity that belied their internal turmoil. Sparks flew like angry, desperate fireflies in the fading afternoon light as the cutting torch began its work, biting into the thick, rusty steel plate. The acrid smell of burning metal mingled with the lingering stench of stagnant lake water, a harsh assault on the senses. Brody, ever the lawman, moved with a controlled urgency, his strategic decision-making on full display. He kept the jostling cluster of reporters and their flashing cameras at bay, his voice a low, firm command. "Keep back. This is an active scene, and we need space." He directed his deputies, ensuring the integrity of the potential evidence, every movement precise, every order crisp. He couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice, that the truth they were about to uncover would change everything, not just for the families involved, but for Silver Creek itself. 6 years of questions, of whispers, of haunting uncertainty were about to be answered, and the anticipation was a cold, hard knot in his gut. The torch roared, a hungry beast devouring the metal. Elias stood a few feet from Brody, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his knuckles white. He watched the process with a desperate intensity, his breath hitched in his throat. He said nothing, but Brody could feel the tremor in the air around him, a silent scream of dread and a fragile, terrifying hope. The metal groaned and shrieked, a tortured protest as the final section of the steel plate was pried loose with a hydraulic claw. A sickening wave of foul-smelling, stagnant lake water gushed out, carrying with it bits of rust and debris, a watery exhalation from the truck's dark secrets. The stench was overpowering, ancient and putrid, but no one flinched. All eyes were fixed on the opening. As the water cleared, revealing the dark interior, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The truck bed was not filled with the tragic remains they had all braced themselves for, the grim confirmation of death that had haunted their dreams for so long. Instead, it was packed, crammed tightly with dozens of sealed, dark green, waterproof containers. They looked like oversized, military-grade ammunition boxes, stacked with a deliberate, meticulous care that spoke of a hidden purpose. Elias let out a choked sound beside Brody, a strange mix of confusion, disbelief, and something that sounded suspiciously like a raw, bubbling relief. It was not the release of tears, but a ragged, involuntary expulsion of air, as if a great weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by another, equally heavy enigma. Brody knelt by the edge of the truck bed, ignoring the water seeping into his trousers, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp, intense circle through the gloom. His hand, steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart, swept the beam over the containers. His breath hitched. On the top of the nearest container, a single word was stenciled in faded black paint, barely visible against the dark green. It was a word that made no sense, a twist so unexpected it left him reeling. The word was Aurum. Aurum, Elias breathed, his voice a hollow rasp that seemed to suck the very air from the chaotic scene. It's Latin. It means gold. The single word, heavy with impossible meaning, rippled through the assembled group on the shores of Serenity Lake, freezing them in place. Gold. Not the waterlogged remains of a father and son, not a weapon, not even a cryptic message of their demise, but dozens upon dozens of sealed, waterproof containers, their dull surfaces reflecting the fading afternoon light. The reality of it slammed into Sheriff Brody with the force of a physical blow, reorienting his entire perception of the case. Liam hadn't been running from a simple debt or a personal demon. He had been involved in something far grander, far more dangerous than Brody could have ever conceived in the quiet confines of Silver Creek. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and ancient metal from the resurrected truck, suddenly crackled with a new, bewildering energy. Brody watched his deputies, their faces a mixture of confusion and burgeoning avarice, begin the painstaking process of offloading the containers from the truck bed. Each clunk and scrape of a new container landing on the tarp-covered ground felt like a drumbeat, signaling the unraveling of everything he thought he knew. His mind raced, struggling to process the impossible twist. Where did this gold come from? And what, in the name of all that was sacred, did it have to do with the disappearance of Liam and Finn 6 years ago? Elias, who had been a tightly coiled spring of grief and rage moments before, now stood strangely still, his eyes fixed on the gleaming containers. The image of his brother as a desperate, reckless victim shattered, replaced by a far more complex and morally ambiguous picture. Was Liam a thief? A brilliant, desperate man driven to extraordinary lengths? Or something else entirely? Elias's hidden motivation, a gnawing need to understand his brother's elusive secrets, now flared into an all-consuming fire. This wasn't just about finding them anymore. It was about understanding the very fabric of Liam's life, and perhaps, the fractured history of their own family. A bitter, almost humorless laugh escaped Elias, barely audible above the low hum of the recovery equipment. A solution to his problems, he murmured to himself, the words laden with a new, dark irony. Brody, seeing the dazed, almost shell-shocked look on Elias's face, knew he needed to act, to regain some semblance of control over the spiraling situation. He barked orders to his deputies, securing the scene, establishing a perimeter that pushed back the increasingly agitated crowd and the flashing cameras of the arriving news crews. This was no longer just a local missing persons case. It was a discovery that would shake the very foundations of his small town, drawing the unwanted attention of state and federal agencies, of every gold prospector and treasure hunter from here to the Pacific. As his team worked with methodical efficiency, Brody pulled Elias aside, leading him away from the immediate chaos towards the relative quiet of a patrol vehicle. The tension that had simmered between them for weeks, born of Elias's arrogance and Brody's small-town pride, had dissolved, replaced by a shared, desperate need for answers. They were no longer adversaries but two men staring into the same abyss of the unknown. Brody leaned against the fender, his voice low, almost a whisper against the backdrop of the distant shouts and the rhythmic splash of water. "Your great-grandfather," he began, the words feeling strangely weighty on his tongue. Was he just a miner? Or was he something more? He watched Elias's face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a missing piece of the puzzle that was now screaming to be found. The conversation from the mine, Elias's earlier comments about Liam chasing ghosts, about their family's past, suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The old North Star mine hadn't been just a hiding place. It had been the source. Liam hadn't been running from a ghost. He had found one. He had found their great-grandfather's lost treasure. Elias looked towards the mountains, their jagged peaks now softened by the twilight, his eyes distant, as if gazing into the mists of time. A profound sadness, mixed with something akin to wonder, settled on his features. "Our family always told stories," he said, his voice barely audible, filled with a newfound reverence. "They called him the alchemist. They said he'd found a way to extract gold from low-grade ore, a secret process he took to his grave. Liam always believed those stories were real." The flashbulbs erupted like a sudden, violent summer storm, momentarily blinding Sheriff Brody as he navigated the scrum of reporters. Gold. The word echoed through Silver Creek, tearing through its quiet existence like a wildfire. What had been a desperate, personal search for a missing father and son had metastasized into a national spectacle. Brody's jaw was tight, his objective now a relentless battle to maintain control of the evidence, dozens of sealed, waterproof containers of precious metal, while simultaneously wrestling with the jurisdictional maze that had sprung up overnight. State and federal agencies, their agents crisp in their uniforms, moved through his small-town office with an almost clinical detachment, their eyes gleaming with the allure of the treasure. The conflict had escalated, shifting from the unforgiving wilderness to the equally treacherous landscape of bureaucracy and public scrutiny. The realistic obstacles now included not just the physical challenges of recovery, but the incessant demands of lawyers, the probing questions of reporters, and the veiled directives of government agents, all circling the dazzling, undeniable fact of the Orem. Amidst the swirling chaos, a fragile, unspoken alliance had formed between Brody and Elias. Elias, his initial city arrogance stripped away by the raw impact of the discovery, now moved with a quiet, desperate intensity. His tailored suit had been discarded for practical work clothes, his hands, once accustomed to boardroom tables, now smudged with the grime of the recovered truck. They were united by a singular, aching question that the gold, in all its gleaming indifference, could not answer. Where were Liam and Finn? The emotional stakes, long dormant beneath layers of grief and resignation, were now agonizingly, acutely awake. To Elias, the monumental discovery of the gold was worthless without his family. Brody felt it too, a heavy weight in his gut, the stark, brutal irony of finding a king's ransom when all he truly wanted was a father and his boy. The high tension in Silver Creek, once a collective fear for the missing, had morphed into a feverish hum of rumor and speculation about the treasure, a constant, low-frequency thrumming that frayed Brody's nerves. They had managed to carve out a small sanctuary from the media's relentless gaze, the secure evidence garage. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of rust and the lingering scent of stagnant lake water. Under the harsh glare of overhead lights, the recovered pickup truck sat, a skeletal beast draped in weeds, still oozing dark water from its crevices. Brody, his brow furrowed in concentration, meticulously documented each container, his gloved hands moving with practiced precision. Elias, meanwhile, moved with a different kind of intensity, his movements almost frantic as he ran his fingers over the truck's rusted surfaces, as if searching for a forgotten whisper. His gaze was drawn to the rear of the vehicle, to the rusted housing of the taillight. It was a small, almost imperceptible detail, a slight bulge that caught his eye. His heart hammered against his ribs. He reached in, his fingers fumbling in the narrow space, and felt something foreign, something unexpectedly smooth. He pulled it out. A small, folded piece of paper, miraculously wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the relentless embrace of the lake. "Sheriff!" Elias's voice was a choked sound, a strangled mix of disbelief and a rekindled, terrifying hope. Brody spun around, his flashlight beam swinging to illuminate Elias's pale, sweat-slicked face. Elias held out the paper, his hand trembling so violently that the oilcloth rustled. Brody took it, his own hands suddenly unsteady. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing a small, folded piece of paper. It was a second message from Liam, a message that had waited 6 years to be found. The handwriting was rushed, frantic, almost illegible in places, as if scrawled in the throes of a desperate escape. It was not, as a part of Brody had braced himself for, a confession or a suicide note. It was a list of instructions. Brody unfolded the paper completely, his eyes scanning the urgent script. It detailed a complex series of financial transactions, of accounts opened under false names, a brilliant, desperate shell game designed to fund a life on the run. The names of banks, the numbers of offshore accounts, all jumbled together in a dizzying display of illicit finance. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile this calculating, secretive Liam with the easygoing father he remembered. This wasn't just a man who had gotten lost. This was a man who had orchestrated an elaborate disappearance. And then, at the bottom of the list, a final, cryptic instruction: follow the river south to the Twin Spires. Brody frowned, the words making no immediate sense. Twin Spires? A landmark? A code? Before he could dwell on it, his gaze fell to the very bottom of the page. There, scrawled in an even more desperate hand, was a short, chilling postscript that plunged them right back into the heart of the darkness they thought they had escaped. It was a final, desperate plea that twisted the knife of the last 6 years. Marcus found me. He knows about the boy. Don't let him win. The worn map, a 6-year-old breadcrumb trail scrawled on the back of Liam's desperate note, stretched across the dashboard of Brody's cruiser. It led them out of the familiar, jagged peaks of the Rockies and into the sprawling, anonymous landscape of the world beyond Silver Creek. The central conflict had a face and a name: Marcus. The objective was no longer to find a body, but to stage a rescue. Brody, acting on the authority the gold discovery had unexpectedly granted him, bypassed much of the federal red tape, his strategic decision-making sharp and decisive. He and Elias, an unlikely duo forged in the crucible of shared grief and renewed hope, became an unofficial, two-man task force driven by a singular, desperate purpose. Elias, with his financial acumen, had spent days hunched over a laptop in a motel room, the screen's harsh glow illuminating the grim set of his jaw. He unraveled the complex web of accounts Liam had created, a brilliant shell game designed to fund a life on the run. Each decrypted transaction, each phantom company, was a thread in a tapestry of fear and ingenuity. The money trail, combined with the cryptic clue, "Follow the river south to the Twin Spires," finally led them to a small, isolated town in a neighboring state. It was a place marked by two distinctive, church-like rock formations that rose from the flat plains like ancient, weathered sentinels. The tension was a constant, thrumming wire stretched between them, a silent hum of anticipation and dread. They were operating on the belief that Liam and Finn were still alive, a belief that felt both essential and incredibly fragile, a gossamer thread that could snap at any moment. The emotional stakes were astronomical. After 6 years of grief and uncertainty, they were on the verge of either a miraculous reunion or a devastating final confirmation. As they entered the town, a sleepy collection of dusty storefronts and quiet homes, Brody felt the air thicken with the weight of their quest. He pulled out his tablet, acting on a hunch, and ran the name Marcus through a database of known associates, cross-referencing it with the location. The search spun for agonizing seconds before a hit flashed across the screen: Marcus Thorne. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. A disgraced geologist and a former partner of Liam's in a failed prospecting venture years ago. The profile painted a picture of a man with a reputation for violence and a consuming greed. He was, without a doubt, the larger man from the mine. The confirmation sent a cold shiver down Brody's spine, solidifying the sinister narrative that had been unfolding. They found him living in a secluded cabin on the edge of the river, a ramshackle structure half hidden by overgrown trees, its windows dark and uninviting. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as they approached on foot, their steps hushed on the leaf-strewn path. Brody's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his hip, his movements calculated and precise, honed by years of law enforcement. Elias, beside him, moved with a raw, almost desperate energy, his face a mask of grim resolve. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. They burst into the cabin, finding Marcus in his workshop, surrounded by crude tools and the faint smell of chemicals. He was a hulking figure, just as Silas had described, his eyes narrowing in surprise and then fear as he saw them. Brody moved first, a blur of practiced efficiency, disarming Marcus before he could react. Elias, fueled by 6 years of pent-up rage and fear, was a force of pure, untamed will, his hands clamping down on Marcus's arms with surprising strength. The truth, when it came out, was more pathetic and ugly than they imagined. Marcus, pinned and defeated, whimpered his confession, his voice cracking with a greedy, broken desperation. He had hunted Liam for the secret of the gold, catching up to him just as Liam was preparing to disappear into the anonymity of a new life. Liam, in a desperate gamble, had faked his and Finn's demise, sinking the truck full of gold to buy them time, to throw Marcus off his trail forever. But Marcus was relentless. He had found Liam and had been extorting him for years, using Finn as leverage. He had kept them prisoners in their own lives, their existence a constant, hushed terror. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic shootout that ended it, but the quiet click of handcuffs and the broken, whimpering confession of a greedy, defeated man. Brody opened the door to the main cabin, his heart in his throat, each beat a thunderous drum against his ribs. The air inside was still, heavy with a quiet tension. A man who looked like a weary, haunted version of the brother Elias remembered looked up from a worn armchair, his eyes wide with disbelief, the light of recognition slowly dawning in their depths. And beside him, playing on the floor with a small hand-carved wooden bird, was a healthy, curious 8-year-old boy, his laughter a soft, innocent sound that filled the sudden silence. Liam's first words were a ragged whisper, a question and a prayer all in one. "Is it finally over?" The hum of the satellite news vans was a constant, low-grade fever in the heart of Silver Creek. It had replaced the hushed whispers of the last 6 years, a mechanical thrum of manufactured interest that felt alien against the granite backdrop of the mountains. Sheriff Brody sat in his usual booth at the Silver Pine Diner, the ceramic mug of coffee warming his palms but doing little to chase the chill from his bones. Through the large window, he watched the reporters, vultures in expensive jackets, trying to coax sound bites from locals who had suddenly become part of a national spectacle. They called it a miracle, a story of survival against all odds. But Brody saw the truth beneath the headlines. He saw it in the way Liam still flinched at sudden movements, in the hollows that 6 years of unrelenting fear had carved under his eyes. He saw it in the fierce, fragile way Elias now stood by his younger brother's side. The city arrogance burned away, leaving behind the raw, unyielding love of a man who had gotten a second chance he never expected. The conflict was over, but its shockwaves still trembled through their lives. Later that afternoon, Brody saw the brothers walking by the river, away from the prying lenses. Liam moved with a hesitant, almost fragile gait, as if still unaccustomed to open spaces. Finn, now a bright and curious 8-year-old, skipped ahead, tossing stones into the current. His laughter a sound so pure and normal it felt like a defiance of the years he had lost. Elias walked beside Liam, not crowding him, but remaining a silent, steadfast presence. Their conversation, carried on the breeze, was not about the gold or the man named Marcus, but about fixing the leaky roof on the old family cabin and whether Finn was old enough for a proper fishing rod. They were rebuilding a life not on the foundations of their fractured past, with its bitter arguments over inheritance, but on the shared, solid ground of their trauma and survival. Liam paused, his gaze fixed on his son. "He doesn't remember anything else, Eli," he said, his voice quiet, heavy with a complex mix of guilt and gratitude. To him, this is the strange new world. Elias simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. Brody left the diner and walked back to the sheriff's office, the cheers for the local hero feeling distant and misdirected. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper. He slid open the drawer of a filing cabinet and pulled out the thick, worn folder for the disappearance of Liam and Finn Hale. He placed it on his desk. Next to it, he placed a much thinner, colder file, its tab bearing a single name, Daniel Brody, his own lost brother. For 6 years, the first file had been a monument to his failure, a constant nagging echo of the second. Now it was closed, resolved. He had stared into the abyss of his greatest personal and professional failure and had, this time, pulled someone back from the edge. But the victory felt hollow. Saving Liam and Finn hadn't resurrected Daniel. It had only sharpened the edges of his ghost, making the 2-decade-old wound feel fresh again. The resolution had brought peace, but it had also brought a painful clarity, a stark reminder of the arbitrary cruelty of fate. Some boys came home, and some were swallowed by the woods forever. The gold, the catalyst for so much pain and desperation, was a distant problem now, a headache for lawyers and government agents in suits. To the 3 men whose lives it had irrevocably altered, it had lost all meaning, becoming nothing more than a heavy, useless metal. That evening, as a crisp autumn chill began to settle over the valley, Brody drove out to Serenity Lake. He stood on the shore where they had pulled the rusted truck from its watery tomb, the water now calm and clear, reflecting the deep purple and orange of the sunset. He thought about the two messages Liam had left behind. The first, scratched into the mine entrance, was a lie designed to protect his son by creating a fiction. The second, tucked away in a taillight, was a truth designed to save him. He finally understood the haunting nature of it all, the reason the case would stay with him long after the news crews had packed up and gone. The things they had found in the water, in the mine, in the earth, they were never just clues. They were the heavy, sunken anchors of the lives that had been left behind, the tangible weight of choices made in desperation. And in the end, all that glittered was the hope that refused to drown. Disclaimer: this is a fictional story of suspense, mystery, and survival. The characters, locations, and events depicted are the product of imagination.